Welcome to Adventures in Fermentation. I'm Dr. Johnny Drain, and each week I talk with scientists and chefs, artists and oddballs, thinkers and tinkerers about the alchemy of microbes. This week I welcome Dr. Emily Leeming, a dietitian and scientist at King's College London. Emily's research focuses on the impact of diet and microbes on mental and cognitive health. Emily is the author of Genius Gut, a book exploring the science of the gut-brain connection. Emily, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm very excited to talk about, all these tiny, living, thriving organisms that are so involved in our health and well-being and our food.
Brilliant. So we'll talk about the gut health and the microbiome later, but the first question I start with is, when did you first fall for the funk?
So my first career was as a private chef on Superyachts, and it used to be something that I used to not talk about so much. I thought it wasn't going to be taken as seriously as a scientist, but now I kind of reclaim that. I think making kind of kimchi that would be exploding out of jars and seeing these kind of bubbles, and it felt like being back in a chemistry lab at school. And I think I just thought that was absolutely amazing. So it's this live, almost like a Tamagotchi that you've got to look after.
Yeah, tell me a bit more about Superyachts and, chefing. And had you done your undergrad and then you went, did the chefing period, or did all of your university education happen after you'd done this stint as a chef?
So I'd had my undergrad was in nutrition, and during the summer holidays, I used to do some private kind of chefing then. And a family that I cooked for happened to have a super yacht. And the day that I graduated, I mean, quite literally, I think I remember coming out of the graduation tent and my phone ringing and kind of picking up and thinking, I probably had a few glasses to celebrate of, some cheap bubbles or something. It was the captain of that boat saying, "Oh my God, our chef's gone AWOL. I've been given your number. Could you be here within a week?" And I thought, well, I want to do my master's, but actually I'd quite like to have, a paid traveling year. Why not go and do that? And I actually ended up doing that for 5 years before I went and did my master's. And I really, really thought that's what I was going to end up doing, because I just had such a love for cooking and for food. And I think as a private chef, you get so many opportunities to just make new things every day. Anything that you're excited or interested by, you can make it. Unlike in a restaurant, you're probably, you're limited to, service and kind of what's coming out. It's usually kind of similar stuff most of the time. Whereas I was like, oh, well, can I make my own yogurt? Let's do that. I will, make all these, start making bread. Lets me understand how I can make bread. And it was just such an amazing creative experience. I really, really enjoyed it.
The captain called you up and said, "Can you be here?" Where was here on that first job?
It was in Mallorca in Spain. And to be honest, I thought that I was like turning up to the Navy or something. I thought I was going to have to wear like boat shoes and, epaulets, on my shoulders. And it was very kind of like, oh, I don't know what's happening. Anyway, it's a very much, you work hard, you play hard. Yeah, it's a very much a lifestyle rather than a job. But I think that's probably true of all things in food quite often. You don't get that much time off, but when you do get time off, you could be in Italy or in the Caribbean, and you paddleboard to the beach, and that was really, it was phenomenal. I kind of still pinch myself that I had the opportunity.
On a ship, inherently you're stocking up everything you need, and then you're bombing off somewhere. How did just like ordering food work on those jobs?
Well, quite often it would be just me on my own going to the supermarket with someone, the boat credit card, and you would stock up. I'd literally be there, with 3 absolutely massive trolleys of shopping on my own. And you could see everybody thinking, what on earth is going on here? And then I'd be kind of putting it all into the car and kind of driving it back to the boat. Or, if we were somewhere quite remote, there was somebody whose name, their job title was the provisioner. And you would pay them a ridiculous amount of money to kind of suddenly source some turbot or, something that was needed right there in the moment. Actually, crossing the Atlantic was quite an interesting one, because that would take about 3 weeks to kind of sail across the Atlantic. So I would have to be quite considerate about what are we getting, making sure we've got enough food for the entire trip, and also using up that food in a way that, your berries, aren't necessarily going to last, same like your herbs. And I think that was probably a key moment as well with the fermentation side. It was kind of like, well, we'll still have some delicious fresh veggies if you've got some of the more of the ferments around. and kind of also using up stuff that's starting to go a little bit sad.
And actually, I mean, lots of breakthroughs in medical history are intimately connected to sort of maritime history and boats and navies. So I suppose there's always been that connection there of how do you not just survive but thrive when you're away from land for a long period of time.
Yeah, and I actually did a conference last weekend, and there was a Navy officer there who's a GP, and he was just talking about, how can we get more, they're at sea for like 3 months on end without necessarily going back. And we're talking a lot about, that fermentation perhaps being something that they could be using on board to do that as well.
Yeah, well, I actually lived on a houseboat in Hackney Wick for the last much of the last 8 years, and I was fermenting a lot of things, but there was also a Tesco and a Sainsbury's very close, so I never encountered the challenges that you encountered. So you did that for 5 years, and by the sounds of it, had a great time, and then you went back to study in Australia, as I understand it.
Yeah, I was chasing the sun. I was not ready to come back to the UK quite yet, so I was in Melbourne, and it's such a foodie place. I think Sydney gets a lot of airtime because it is gorgeous, but I would say Melbourne has the better food. It's very underground, a lot of it as well. So that was great. I did my master's as a dietitian, training as a dietitian for 2 years, and really got the research bug while I was there. I wasn't expecting to go into research at all. It especially, so different to what I've been doing previously, but I ended up coming back and doing a research internship at King's in the gut, researching the gut microbiome. And that just absolutely sparked for me. So as soon as I finished my master's, I was straight into a PhD.
And the title of that was Novel Computational and Multivariate Approaches to Explore Diet Microbe Relations, if I'm not mistaken.
I think you're the only person who's ever said that out loud to me. Even if I asked my family, or, they'd just be like, yeah, that was it.
And so, some of those words are kind of long words, which might sound like word salad for lots of listeners. Can you just unpack, computational and multivariate, and how, what were you doing and what were you hoping to find out? Often when you start a PhD, you hope to find out this huge amount of things, and then 3.5 years later, you're happy with having found out a much smaller amount of that. Can you talk about how that experience was for you?
Yeah, so I really what I was trying to look at was the relationship between diet and the gut microbiome and its effect on health, but looking at new ways that we can explore dietary data. So kind of computational, it's kind of using, kind of programming, for example, and kind of data analysis, and kind of having all these kind of different data points that you can kind of put together, and can you shape it like a, Tetris pack in different ways. So it was looking at different methods, and, even almost like taking some of the methods that we use to understand the complexity of the gut microbiome, and seeing whether, could we look at the complexity of diets? Because I think on the surface, people's diet seems very simple, but actually it is very complex. Everyone eats in a slightly different way, or a very different way. You pair foods together at different meals. And then the context that you're eating it in as well, what time of day, how often, where you happen to be, and all these different things. And I think for me, it was very interesting to kind of think at it in a very more almost like holistic way, and really think like, if we step back to the drawing board, could we then have, more insights into this relationship between diet and the microbiome? So that was, I absolutely loved it. And, I got offered that PhD. I absolutely was thrilled. It was just the ideal topic for me. So really, really enjoyed it. And I'm still in that research department now, studying the gut microbiome.
And, those sort of data sets, what would they be like? Self-reported? Is it like Johnny saying, well, I had, cornflakes for breakfast? Or is it, something about anonymized blood samples from GPs? Or what kind of data were you unpacking there?
So we have a cohort of now nearly 17,000 twins. It's what's called an observational cohort. So it started in, I think, 1992, 1993, and effectively we've had all these wonderful twins come in, and they, on a regular basis, they will come into the clinic and get tested for multiple things, and they all then also write down their diet data, and also kind of we'll collect lots of different kind of surveys and questionnaires from them as well. So it's really tracking them over time, and then looking at those associations with their gut microbiome and with their health as well. But now we're shifting more into what's called like an interventional space. And so for the everyday person, that's like, we're coming up with some actions that we want them to take. And that's, looking at early onset colorectal cancer risk and the gut microbiome, and doing a kind of whole diet intervention that'll be around fibre.
So can you sort of explain how, if I was a participant, what would you be asking me to do, and what would my obligations be?
Well, we're still in the very early phases of designing it. So I don't want to kind of, see down the line. I have some of the twins being like, hold on a second. But really recognizing the importance of fibre for your gut health. And can we actually give certain recommendations for whole grains, for nuts and seeds, for beans and legumes, which are, actually nearly kind of usually 3 to 4 times higher in fiber than most fruits and vegetables. And we don't have recommendations for them currently. So just looking at, can we give very simple practical advice? I feel very strongly about that, because I really think it's very easily in science to get very excited about something that scientists are excited about, but it might not shift the needle. And it might not have a translational piece for the everyday person. So in an ideal world, it's kind of, a marriage of everything. Obviously, you can never guarantee you're going to have a result. But I think that translational piece for me, for the everyday person, is always shaping how I'm doing my research and really thinking about that.
I hear many more scientists now talking about like translational research. Do you think that's a term that's become popularized in recent years, or is it something that more and more researchers are thinking about, or obliged to think about, based on sort of grants and funding?
Yeah, I don't know whether translational research, sometimes I think the way I'm just talking about it, I feel like I'm just like, well, it's got to translate. But I think there is also a complete type of research that's called translational research that I feel like is something maybe a bit different, or maybe it's not. I think it's, I think a lot of researchers now are really trying to talk to patients, for example, and really pull everyone in together, because it's very easy to be, especially the kind of research we do, which is very kind of data orientated. You're not necessarily interacting with people, to just be like sat behind your computer and really obsessed with the numbers, but forgetting that is a real person, and they're looking, we're looking for a solution. I feel like that maybe that's not always the case. And I think scientists are terribly paid. We're all in there for the reason that we're trying to advance and do good. So across the board, I think we should be giving ourselves a pat on the back. But there's little things, little quirks there that I think is important to consider.
Yeah, I spend probably more time than I should on Instagram these days, but I see a lot of very cool scientists doing very cool work being accused of being sort of shills for XYZ. And the idea, which is laughable if you're a scientist, or any scientist, or you've ever studied science or spent any time in that realm, that scientists are getting paid very well for any of the things they do, let alone the kind of pro bono advocacy that people like yourself do on social media and in public engagement. It's such a joke.
I really feel, it makes me feel that I'm like, this is so ridiculous. So, as you say, like we do, the talks that we give are completely free. You do not, we pay the journal to take to review, our research papers. We don't get any money off them than that. They charge, 50 quid for you to access it. And I think, even if someone is consulting for industry, what are they getting? It's making probably a tiny little, shift for maybe their month's rent that month, but all that, their entire lifetime is not, so I think, as you say, and people are in science, to make a difference. It's just, and I think I'm so grateful to work with the people I work with. They are just phenomenal. And it's a great environment to be in.
Actually, I've got a bunch of next questions. We'll definitely go back to talking about fiber and actually talking about kind of contentious issues where people accuse other people on the internet of being a shill. I want to ask you a question about leaky gut syndrome, but just there, I don't know, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about the experience of working in academia versus working in sort of hospitality and chefdom, because I've straddled both of those, and there's similarities, but there's huge differences, and I'm curious about your experience.
Yeah, I think it's both. I feel like are more lifestyle jobs than clocking on 9 to 5. I think there's a lot of pressure to get scientific papers out, and that's really your currency of how. Which can be really tough. So I think, I guess that's probably similarities on that side. I think with, the chefing side for me, I really loved that I was like chatting and engaging, and I think with different people. And I think I loved shaping and shifting the food that I was making according to what that person's needs and wants were. So I felt like my cooking was more of almost like a chameleon. It was like that person said that they don't like their skin on the cucumber. Right? I'm going to remember that. And like every tiny little thing, I was just like, right. And, just really shifting and shaping. And that was so interesting. So I guess in a way I was kind of collecting data points and then processing that and being like, okay, well, that's going to inform what I'm doing. I don't know. Maybe what have you got? You got some other differences or similarities?
Well, I think you've sort of alluded to one which I always found very interesting. And I suppose I went the opposite way to you. I went from science to food. But the feedback loop with food is so much shorter. Like you cook something, I mean, depends what the setup of the kitchen is, but it goes out and someone looks at it and they put it in their mouth and they either sort of smile or they grimace. And even if you can't see them eating, by how much is left on the bowl or plate when it comes back to kitchen, whether they loved it or didn't like it at all. And there's something really nice about that feedback loop being short. Whereas in lots of science, I mean, most science, and I mean, the sort of science I was doing was very theoretical. So basically, you're almost operating in this sort of vacuum. I mean, I know your work has a shorter lifespan, and the stuff that all of your crew at King's and the Zoe crew, it seems to be coming into the public domain relatively quickly, but it's still much longer than the 10 minutes it takes for someone to eat a bowl of soup and decide whether they like it or not.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the kind of joke that we also used to say, you're only as good as your last meal, which was brutal, with the guests, because they just remember what they'd last eaten, and you'd be judged on that rather than the whole.
And also, people tend to remember the things that they disliked more strongly than the things that they liked, in my experience.
Yeah, I think that's just a human thing, though, isn't it? I think which we all have to guard ourselves against.
Yeah. Let's go back to the question around so you're a passionate advocate for fibre, and I saw you watched your TEDx talk, and in that you talk about what our gut microbes might eat if they're not if they don't have access to the things that they like eating. And you describe this the microbes consuming the mucus and the lining, and then these kind of holes developing. And obviously there's the thing called leaky gut syndrome, or a phrase which gets bandied around a lot. And I wanted to ask whether you could unpack that phrase and what's fact and what's fiction about it, and how it fits into some of the things that your research is looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing I was talking about in the TEDx is effectively, we see this in mice models. So it's this early evidence, and we see it kind of signaled in humans, kind of early signs. The reason we haven't probably seen it in a stronger way in humans yet is just the measures for testing, the amount of mucus that's there, and also the widening of the gaps between the cells and your gut lining. They're actually not very reliable. So again, talking about the randomized control trial that we're doing, that's kicking off the end of the year, kind of early next year, we're having so many discussions. We're kind of working with collaborators in Harvard and different universities to really just, get feedback and pooling how is it that we can research this in a way so we can really kind of show this clearly, because it's been very difficult to do. But effectively, what we think is happening from the mice models is that when there's a lack of fibre, this is your gut microbes' favourite food, they then turn to another food and energy source. And that is effectively this kind of mucus that is cushioning your gut barrier lining. This mucus then gets kind of fed on, and then it breaks down, and there might be then this kind of patches that appear in your gut lining, and then effectively you have these kind of nice cells all kind of sandwiched together, and when things start getting a bit problematic, those gaps between the cells can kind of widen so much that things that we wouldn't want to be kind of trespassing through can then trespass through into the body. And then is that then this kind of early flame and fire of triggering kind of an immune response, which we know is, if that's happening on a long-term kind of excessive level, low-grade level, that can then be a risk factor for diseases like heart disease and type 2 diabetes and other things happening. So I think the difficulty is when we talk about because that's called intestinal permeability, which is effectively, as you say, like leaky gut. The thing is, in general kind of wellness sphere, that becomes kind of overly pathologized and really like it takes its own own entity and own kind of syndrome, and that's not really where kind of the science is kind of at. What we tend to see is that this is happening kind of, when we see this intestinal impermeability is also happening where, there is a disease, for example. It's kind of more of a symptom of something else going on. And also, you can get, this intestinal permeability if you're just doing exercise and then it kind of firms up again. So I think there's this really interesting relationship between, low fiber diet tends to be a less healthy diet. You're getting less nutrients coming into your body to support your health. Your microbes are unhappy, and we know this kind of basically your gut is kind of the gateway to the rest of your body. So that's, having a consequence. And yeah, so I think it's, we'll kind of wait and see to understand a bit more and further from that.
Thanks. That's a great explanation. And, so you've talked there a little bit about how we're not eating, almost none of us, certainly in like Western Europe, the US, are not eating enough fiber. And, we're definitely having our sort of protein needs met. Protein for whatever reason is sort of sexy. I think carbs are also sexy and people covet both of them. But fiber somehow isn't sexy. It's like,
Don't say that. You say that.
I should phrase it more carefully. In the eyes of the, most of the population, It's not sexy. It's like, my dad eating all bran, or my mum forcing my dad to eat all bran. What do we need to kind of reinvigorate the power and the potential of fiber in the eyes of, the general populace? How do we get more fiber?
I think, fiber's had a tough rap, right? I kind of joke, and I talk about this in the book a bit like this, that it's a little bit like fiber's a bit like, when Lois Lane met Clark Kent and she thought he was just some kind of bit awkward, geeky journalist. And actually he's like flying around in his very tight, leggings and cape or whatever it was. And, fiber is like that. I think it's just seen as this thing that helps you have nice poo, basically. I'm a big believer in not talking about stools or bowel movements or anything like that.
Yeah.
Let's just call it what it is. And it is actually, great, so important for our gut microbiome, gut microbes, favorite food. But it's also really important for our heart health and our blood sugar control. It helps to keep us feeling fuller for longer. It's related to lower risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, colorectal cancer. It's such an impactful, powerful nutrient. And yet most of us, 83% of us, are not eating the fiber that we need, which is 30 grams of fiber a day. That's an overwhelming amount to people. And that deficit isn't even a small deficit. It's a kind of 35% deficit. Most of people in the UK are eating about 18 to 20 grams of fiber. So I feel very kind of strongly that fiber is sexy. It is very cool. It's not just about digestive brown flakes or kind of bland wholemeal bread. It's found in all the foods that we get excited about, who people are passionate about food. It's in fruits, vegetables, beans, legumes, whole grains, nuts and seeds, really this like wide variety. And we want that wide variety because they all contain lots of different fiber types that have different characteristics for our health. And it's probably, I really believe it's one of those, by adding in more fiber is one of the most simple, impactful things that we can do for our health and well-being. Because even in these foods that are high in fiber, they're also densely packed with many other nutrients that we need for our health and well-being. So just by adding in and focusing on getting more fiber, you're naturally meeting many other nutritional needs without even necessarily needing to think about it.
Chocolate as well, also quite high in fiber, typically dark chocolate, no?
Yes, that's always a happy days, right? It's about 11 grams per 100 grams. That's pretty sizable. In comparison, just to kind of do a little comparison there, lettuce is 1.8 grams per 100 grams. Not to say that we shouldn't be eating lettuce, but I feel like there's always some opportunity for 2 squares of dark chocolate after lunch or something, or as a snack with some fruit.
So there are lots of amazing ways that we can get more fiber into our diets. It's just that most of us, myself included probably, aren't consuming enough of it at the minute.
Yeah, it's so I like to talk about what I call the BGBGs. So it's BGBGS. So that's beans, greens, berries, Grains as in whole grains, and then seeds as in nuts and seeds. And the reason why I think that's so important to like keep those in mind is that I think it's really easy for us, most people to know what a high protein food is. They'll straight away be like, eggs, meat, fish. But, when it comes to fiber, it is like people are just like, oh, it's brown and stodgy and that's it. Whereas actually, we've got these, if we kind of think about the BGBGs and have them as regular features on our shopping list and make them a kind of active part of our day, it's delicious for us and it's delicious for our gut microbes. And you don't have to think too much about it, because if you're getting them in regularly, it's going to be so much easier for you to get that 30 grams of fiber you need without needing to be doing lots of calculations.
You mentioned the word poo there, and I have a question ready prepared. So you've got a publication from 2021, the title of which is Blue Poo, Impact of Gut Transit Time on the Gut Microbiome Using a Novel Marker, which I cannot not bring up. So tell us about blue poo. How did you make it? There's probably a few different ways that one can make poo blue. And what did you learn from it?
I'm so glad. This is making me so happy that this is getting brought up. I also don't know how I got away with just, calling it the paper that. And I think I spent far too long trying to turn a poo emoji blue to have in the abstract image. So that's my thing that I probably spent most time on to try and get the visual stuff sorted. So that was effectively these kind of bright, kind of blue, Cookie Monster blue muffins that were given to participants. And what these wonderful participants did was they measured the time that they first started eating these blue muffins, and then how long it took until they saw a blue poo in the toilet bowl. And that is effectively a measure of is something called your gut transit time. So how long it takes for your body to digest something. You really want this kind of to be in the kind of happy range of too fast. It's more like kind of diarrhea. Too slow is more like that you have constipation, but you might not kind of realize it's constipation. It might just be a really slow transit time. And what we saw was that people who had a slower transit time tended to be associated with having a less healthy microbiome. So more kind of unhappy microbes that had been associated with kind of poor heart and kind of blood sugar control.
And I'm curious, why the color blue? I mean, I presume red would be a no-go because there's, in case that you've got blood in the stools, but were there any other contenders for different colors, or was there a very specific rationale behind blue? And then also what did you use to make it blue?
Yeah, so it was a blue food dye. We had, in the paper we talked about whether we, could have used kind of a red dye or beetroot, for example. But I think, as you say, anyone who's had beetroot and forgotten about it, you do get an absolute panic thinking, oh no, there is something here. And also I think it is harder to see a kind of a color, the kind of red with brown versus a kind of blue with brown. The other thing kind of we thought about, and this is a way I normally talk about it for the everyday person, is like, actually, you could use sweet corn very easily, and just, having a couple of corn on the cobs and seeing for you, where does that land is probably a nice way to do it as well.
Nice. And so, you also talk there a little bit about kind of we use these words and we have to be a bit careful, but like good and bad, bacteria. And obviously it's a bit more nuanced than that. But, I talked to some people who are very involved in particular species and strains of microbes, and your work is much kind of more high level, and you're looking at kind of processes and outcomes and effects of the diet. Do you have any favorite microbes? And is there one that sort of, I talked to some people and a particular strain of microbe has changed the course of their life. Do you have any close relationships with specific microbes?
I don't know in the book whether you realize, but I don't think I named a microbe once in the book. And there's a reason for that, because I totally see that, there are some interesting microbes that are doing different things. I think, quite often when I talk about good and bad microbes, I've got the little inverted commas whenever I say it, because it's really difficult. We see certain microbes will be, acting in a really positive way in one condition or disease, and acting in a completely opposite problematic way in a completely different situation. And actually we see differences between men and women. So I just don't think, for me, that it's easy to pinpoint certain microbes very easily. I mean, there are obviously some that we see kind of Fusobacterium nucleatum in colorectal cancer that seems to be like consistently showing up. I tend to really just prefer to step back and look at it as this kind of complex ecosystem. And actually, it's really about not so much who's there, but what are they doing and what molecules are they producing? How are they interacting with your body? Because, you and I probably have very different microbiomes. We know they're as kind of unique as a fingerprint, but they could be producing kind of very similar molecules for our health, particularly depending on what we're eating, if we're eating kind of similar diets. And that's really what's important. It's like the action that they're having for our health and well-being. And, I think that's really where this diet piece comes in, because that's the food they're eating, that's on their dining room table, that's helping them to make those molecules.
And what's the future of whether the gut-brain axis or kind of diet shaping our microbiomes? What are you most excited about? And are there any very recent discoveries maybe that have come out even since you wrote your book that have kind of blown your mind, or you're very, very enthusiastic about?
Gosh, I feel like I think we need more consensuses on this. This is probably this is a real scientist. Someone's not going to be so excited about this, but I think we need to have like a standardization of how we look at the microbiome, so we can then compare against different studies, or like pull different studies together. Because I think the processing techniques of even the stool, for example, so I'm going to use the science term because that's how we as scientists would say. So that poo sample that we take the microbes from, going back to my PhD here, I really think diet and nutrition, there is an absolute piece where we can make a massive step forward and understand that relationship a lot more as well. Just collecting that data. How can we collect that data in a better way? Can we have nutrition databases, for example? We know there's 26,000 biochemicals in food, and yet we have maybe up to 120 in most nutrition databases. I think that's very exciting to me, that there's a lot that we've learned so far, but I think there's still a huge opportunity for us to go even further. And I think what's so great about the gut microbiome is that, unlike our genes, which we can't change, we can change our gut microbes. And hopefully, as people who love food in a way that's also delicious and enjoyable, and doesn't feel like, doing something that I think people think health is a sad lettuce, iceberg lettuce with no dressing and a token slice of tomato. And it's like, no, we're moving way past that.
Yeah. I mean, I think flavor and then cooking are such key parts of this conversation, and it doesn't have to be, as you say, joyless. It can be absolutely the opposite, that we can eat better, tastier, cheaper food, and for it to have better health outcomes for us, right?
Yeah. And I think I'm a big, fan of adding foods in for our health rather than kind of cutting them out. I think, we beat ourselves up so much, and that kind of stress impact is also kind of bad for our health. We don't need to act having had a piece of cake like we've robbed a bank or kind of, stabbed someone. And for our gut microbes as well, we've seen, in research, they're actually pretty resilient and stable. And one meal and one point in time is not going to do anything for them, particularly stuff that really gets absorbed far higher up and doesn't even reach your gut microbes.
What would examples of that stuff that gets processed higher up be?
So your gut microbes live in your lower large intestine, but before that, there's a really long kind of garden hose pipe, which is effectively your small intestine, and that's the first pit stop after your swirling sac of acid, which is your stomach. And so along this long garden pipe, 90% of the nutrients from the food you eat is absorbed. Fibre is different. So fibre, your body isn't able to absorb and break down in your small intestine, which is why it tends to then land in your large lower intestine. Anything that's kind of undigested then lands on the dining room table of the kitchen table. I'm going to call dining room table, so I feel like they're quite posh. Yeah, of your gut microbes, and they have a feast. It's like Glastonbury for them.
Mm. So it's the fiber that's going all the way down on this sort of like caravan, this convoy, and most of the other stuff is getting
Yeah.
much earlier.
Yeah. So things like sugar, for example, gets absorbed. So it's and protein and the rest of this kind of simple carbs. You will have perhaps some still making it to the gut, but that tends to happen if you're having a diet that is high in sugar, which tends to also be just an unhealthy, less healthy diet. Then you probably maybe have an overspill of some sugar. Same with protein. If you're eating a lot of protein, and particularly with a lack of fiber, that could then be problematic with your gut microbes, then making perhaps more harmful molecules because they switch from feeding on the fibre to feeding on partly on the protein. And we think that perhaps that's not such a good thing.
Mm. So it's been a while since you worked professionally as a chef, but do you still have a love for cooking? What do you cook at home when you have the time and sort of bandwidth to do so?
Yeah, I think my cooking has absolutely changed in style. I used to be like, let me make this special tiny little jelly to go, with a little frondy thing on it. Can't think of anything worse now. I love to eat that. I just don't want to make it. So now it's about colourful, minimal washing up. I think anybody who's worked in a kitchen, appreciates not having to do much washing up, unless obviously you've got someone to do it for you, which I didn't really ever have that. And it's quick and easy, you know, high in fibre, protein, it's just feel good food without the stress.
I read a quote from, it's the couple, husband and wife, who run Honey and Co. I forget their names, but they said if something can't go in a dishwasher in their house, it doesn't exist. And I've been trying to channel that recently. And basically, if I think something might not go in, I try it once and it either comes out the same as it was or it doesn't, and then I get rid of it.
Yeah, I definitely think, apart from 1 or 2 knives that I was gifted back in the day, those were like, I'm terrified. But I rarely cook them now because I just cook with I've got like a knife from IKEA, which people are now horrified by, but it goes in the dishwasher. So I don't care, it works.
Yeah, I'm the same. I have these I think they're kind of cool. I think it's hippie glass. You get them from Nisbets, the kitchen provisions supplier, and they're like cheap as chips, but they hold their sharpness. You can do anything you want to them, and if they break, you can replace them very easily as well. All right, we'll do some quick fire questions now. So these are a little bit more tangential, but what profession other than your own would you like to do?
Oh, I'd love to be an architect. I think maybe everybody has them. Does everyone have a secret kind of love the fact that they'd love to just design your own house or something in the future? I think that'd be so fun. But I think the actual realities of it, because it's like 9 years of training or something, which is actually, having said that, probably better stay amount that I've actually done with this career. I just think that sounds so fascinating. It'd be amazing.
So if there was a kind of third phase pivot for you, it would be not chef, not microbiome scientist, but you'd go into architecture.
Yeah, what could it be? A microbial foodie needs to be consistent, which I think.
Well, I like, there's lots of people now creating, designing buildings that have, kind of their own microbiomes and microbes in cells. And, you look at things like Legionnaire's disease, which is a function of what happens when we change environments and the microbes are not used to it and don't like it. So I think you could definitely seg into an architecture career.
There we go. I'll do that tomorrow. I quit.
And is there anything that you think, and this could be informed by the things you've done in the past, any profession that you think you really wouldn't like to do?
Yeah, anything that's probably, I don't really like anything that's like, and this is not a job, puzzles, cannot do. Putting furniture together, cannot, like a DIY person, I absolutely cannot do it. I will effectively screw a screw into my leg by mistake or something like that. So I think that's just like a hazard waiting to happen. Yeah, and those instructions, I don't think are actually that simple. I've those estimations of 30 minutes is not 30 minutes for me.
Yeah, well, I also think with globalization now, a lot of the instructions come without words, right? So they're universal. So they're just pictorial, and some of them are very kind of vague.
Yeah, and there's always like 1,000 different types of screws, and I'm like, surely, I don't understand. Pick up bag A versus bag Z. Yeah, that stresses me out.
It's a no handy person.
Having said that, I was going to be an architect. I'm obviously just not going to be any use on the actual implementation side.
Yeah, well, there's other people. There's like, is it civil engineers that do that sort of stuff for the architects? Any favorite fermented things you've ever tasted that really stick in your mind?
You know what? And I probably should have thought about this. This has just come into my mind now, and it should have really been that first question. But my first experience of kefir has just popped into my mind now, and it's it kind of. I'm trying to think how related she is. She's my dad's cousin. So let's just say she's an aunt, even though I know that's not technically correct. And she went off to. She's a fabulous artist. I mean, absolutely incredibly talented. And she went off to, I think, Turkmenistan. And there they were making a lot of kefir with, I think, she was kind of traveling around and came back. And I think I went to visit her, and she had, and it was the most, I still remember to this day, it's the most fermented kefir I've ever had in my life. I mean, it was just so sour and so fizzy. I thought it was just, I mean, it terrified me. I thought I was going to have food poisoning. But that was like a great induction. And actually, yeah, that stuck in my mind, just being such like a great memory.
How old were you? What era was that? Was that whilst you were a chef, or
I
when you were?
think I must have been 18 or 19 or something. So it just was not on anyone's radar. And I just was like, why am I having this kind of off milk,
Yeah.
off yogurty milk? Yeah.
There is something with, there's lots of fermented foods which for various reasons can be, have pungent smells, or they can, the fizziness. But I think anything that is milky but fizzy is if you grow up in a culture where milk is not fizzy, is really weird. And there's a deep disgust impulse that like kicks in, that sort of says, am I doing something really, really terrible for myself here?
Yeah. Well, obviously I just, skipped out the door afterwards. So it did me some good.
Yeah. And actually, do you have any sort of favorite go-to ferments that are, regularly on your counter, in your fridge, that you're picking up from shops, etc. these days?
Yeah, I would say kefir is usually just a consistent feature. I think mainly as well because most of the research that we have is on kefir, and it just seems to have most of, some great health benefits that are coming out from it. And it's such an easy one. It's affordable to make. It's very easy to make. You can buy it. You can add it to many things. Just, I add it to my breakfast, but I also add it to things like salad dressing to kind of make it a bit more creamy. So that's great. I'm not actually a huge kombucha fan. I've never been somebody who's interested in any drinks, regardless. So, and I think it just tends to be quite sweet in a lot of the commercial ones. And also we've only had a few very kind of handful of human studies that, and it doesn't seem to be that anything that exciting yet in terms of the benefits, but I'm sure the jury's a little bit out on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree. I have to tread carefully because I'm friends with lots of fermenters and people that make kombucha. So I think a lot of the commercial ones are like absolutely rank, but there's a much larger number of smaller producers making the kombuchas, which are definitely
Yeah,
good
I absolutely agree with
and
that.
interesting.
The smaller producers, I think, yeah.
And actually, so you said there that the research for kefir is very strong compared to some other fermented ingredients. Is that because there's been more research, or do people get positive research results in early studies, and so therefore more people have tested it? What's sort of what's going on there?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that there's been more research on kefir. Don't really know why versus on kombucha, for example. I think the thing with just because there isn't research on it doesn't mean there's not a potential benefit. I think really my kind of qualms with kombucha tends to be that a lot of the more commercial ones that you get in the supermarket because you have to add lots of sugar to them to get that kind of fermentation starting, to kind of feed the microbes. They tend to still be very high in sugar and not much kind of microbial action going on. So you are basically having a sweetened tea. So I think it'll be interesting to see what, I think, there's more being done on kimchi. Sauerkraut, I would have thought the Germans would have, been, researching that to the nth degree. But yeah, it's their kind of national dish.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I know in Korea there's sort of like a national scientific research into kimchi agency thing. I guess that doesn't exist in Germany, Poland, Eastern Europe. But yeah, I'm always surprised that it doesn't seem there to be as much research done into sauerkraut versus something broadly analogous like kimchi.
Yeah, I think also this kind of speaks a lot more around nutrition as well, is that, there's not been as much research done on kind of whole individual foods versus looking at dietary patterns, and also certain ways that the nutrition data is collected in these large population cohorts don't ask questions around fermented foods, in particular fermented foods. So we don't have like the association there either. So I really say it's more recently. I mean, similar with the gut microbiome, there's some great work coming in the US where they're doing kind of controlled feeding studies, very particularly around broccoli, and let's see the impact of broccoli on the microbiome. So I think it will, gut health gut microbiome is here to stay. Yes, it's a massive trend this last 2 years, but it's, this forgotten organ that we're not going to be just passing and moving on from. it's going to be more and more research coming out, which is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, totally agree. This is another slightly odd one. I'm very passionate about water and think it's sort of way more interesting than people give it credit for. Do you have, and given that you've probably spent more days than most right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean gazing into the horizon, do you have a favorite or most memorable sip of water from your life?
I think maybe not a sip of water, but I do feel like, since we were talking about boats and you just said about being in the Atlantic Ocean, my most kind of awe-inspiring experience was being in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and it was kind of dark at night. Don't know what I think. I must have been on watch. You have to you always have to have someone on deck to,
And
eyes out.
even a chef to do that as well.
On the early days, later on,
Okay.
I got to not do that. But my first job, I definitely had to get stuck in on that. And just being on the bow and having this kind of phosphorescence of the plankton. And then there were the dolphins. I mean, it sounds like something out of a Disney movie. Just going and along the bow and jumping in and out of this phosphorescence. And that for me was just amazing.
Wow. Were you anchored up or you were still navigating?
So if you're crossing the Atlantic, there's nowhere to kind of anchor up. You keep on going. Yeah. You're just in the middle of nowhere. You're a tiny dot in the Atlantic.
So does that mean that there's someone sort of driving the boat, or you just let the waves take you in the nighttime hours?
So you would always be kind of either motor sailing. So you've kind of got some of the sails a little bit up.
Yeah.
But you would be motoring along. You'd be going with a trade wind. So it'd be usually very smooth and calm, because of course these boats are effectively like, a very, 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 very expensive Ferrari. So you don't want anything to happen, unless you really have to be at rough seas, and which we would be occasionally, but quite often when you're crossing the Atlantic, you wanted to minimize. If something goes wrong, no one's going to come and rescue you. Maybe, for a while, but then you're a couple of days later.
Yeah. Did you watch that film Triangle of Sadness, which has
I watched the first half. I don't know why I didn't watch the second half. I don't know. I think I watched the projectile vomiting scene.
Yeah. Actually, it starts in a restaurant, and then it's quite food-based, I suppose. It starts in a restaurant, and then there's this very graphic scene where everyone is ill on a boat. And hopefully it wasn't like that.
No, I think occasionally, yeah, people would be, it's usually that first day at sea where you haven't got your sea legs. And if you'd had a big night out before, which you learn very quickly never to do.
Yeah. All right, fine. A couple of questions. I mean, based on your your research, some of it at least relies on having lots of twins at hand. And I don't know if there's a prevalence of twin hotspots in the world. There probably are. Someone's probably studied it. But are there any places that you would love to, live and work in the future?
I mean, I feel like every day I'm like, oh, I'd love to live there, So I think I need to watch Under the Tuscan Sun again. I think that's been something now where you have your kind of dilapidated villa and probably lots of I'd love to have some runner ducks and some bees. That would be quite nice. So I don't know, anywhere. I feel like I get very excited about anywhere. It'll change, within 24 hours.
I love runner ducks are great. A friend of mine actually had some in the very center of Birmingham, and they seemed very happy. But they're very fun and funny, and good company.
Yeah, I think they just make me laugh. And I think anything that just, those little kind of sparks of joy, I think are the most important things, really.
Yeah, I think I'm a big lover of goats. I think they're like the funniest animal. So I would love one day to have somewhere where we can have goats, but they are quite destructive in terms of their eating habits.
Would you have goat's milk and cheese?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, nice.
Finally, any sort of resources that you would recommend for people out there interested in any of the aspects of work or food or fermented foods that you've touched upon throughout your career?
Yeah, absolutely. I might do a little cheeky plug of my newsletter.
I was going to mention it at the end, but
because I write that every week, I'm very big on anything that's kind of gut microbiome related and health and nutrition. So it's called Second Brain. It's on Substack. You can subscribe to free, all kind of, anyway, have a look. In terms of other resources, there's the ISAP, which is ISS. Is that right? Have I said that right? Which is effectively the international kind of association of probiotics and prebiotics. It must be two P's. And that's a really good resource for anything that's around just general information around probiotics and prebiotics. I'm trying to think what else. I do like the Gut Microbiota for Health website, which has got really, they've got really good breakdowns quite often of kind of new exciting studies that have come out. So they tend to be a good one to just keep an eye on.
Amazing. And I've been a subscriber to Second Brain for, I guess, over 12 months now. And can
Thank you.
strongly recommend it. And I think, it's very successful. You have like over 40,000 subscribers, no?
Yeah, it's I don't know. There's people there, which is wonderful. I'm not just writing into an echo chamber anymore, which I definitely was at the beginning. But it feels very nice. It's a great community.
Amazing. And so, if you want to learn more about Emily and Emily's work, you can follow you on, I think it's at Dr. Emily Leeming on Instagram, right?
Yes.
And just to say again, a big fan of this book and still available in all good bookstores. Thank you so much for your time today, Emily. It's been fascinating talking to you, and I'm excited about the future and all of your research to come and your various other projects as well.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. Cheers. Goodbye.